May 16, 1940, dawned over Washington with an urgency that few Americans could yet comprehend. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress, his voice steady but grave, as he delivered what German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels would soon dismiss as the ravings of a desperate man. The president called for the production of 50,000 aircraft per year, a figure so staggering that even his closest advisors had blanched when they first heard it. The German High Command, flush with victories across Europe, laughed at the announcement. Their intelligence reports painted a picture of an American industrial base still mired in Depression-era lethargy, with an aviation industry that had produced fewer than 6,000 military aircraft in all of 1939. The skepticism wasn't limited to Berlin. Within America's own military establishment, senior officers privately questioned whether such production was even theoretically possible. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, knew the brutal mathematics. The entire American aviation industry employed roughly 63,000 workers in 1940, scattered across a handful of companies that were still building planes largely by hand. The largest aircraft factory in the nation, Douglas Aircraft's plant in Santa Monica, California, could produce perhaps one bomber per day under optimal conditions. Roosevelt's goal would require building hundreds of such facilities, training hundreds of thousands of workers, and fundamentally reimagining how aircraft could be manufactured. Yet Roosevelt understood something that the doubters, both foreign and domestic, did not fully grasp. America possessed an industrial capacity that had merely been dormant, not destroyed, by the Great Depression. The same automobile factories that had revolutionized mass production in the 1920s stood ready to be repurposed. The same engineering talent that had created assembly lines for Ford and General Motors could be redirected toward bombers and fighters. According to historical records maintained by the National Archives, Roosevelt had been meeting quietly with industrial leaders since late 1939, laying groundwork for a mobilization that most Americans didn't yet know they needed. The president's scientific advisors had provided him with detailed studies showing that aircraft production could follow the same principles Henry Ford had applied to automobiles. William Knudsen, former president of General Motors, had been brought into the government specifically to oversee this transformation. Knudsen told Roosevelt that if the automobile industry could produce 4 million cars in 1929, then a fully mobilized American industry could certainly produce 50,000 aircraft annually, provided the government was willing to make unprecedented investments and sweep away the regulatory obstacles that had constrained production during peacetime. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels seized upon Roosevelt's speech for a propaganda broadcast that would echo through history. Speaking to the German people on May 18, 1940, Goebbels declared that Roosevelt's 50,000 plane promise was typical American bluster and mathematical impossibility dressed up as political rhetoric. The German people, he assured his listeners, had nothing to fear from a nation that couldn't even adequately arm its own military. The Luftwaffe, battle-tested and victorious, would sweep aside any American aerial opposition. German newspapers ran cartoons showing Roosevelt building toy planes from paper. The mockery seemed justified. At that moment, Germany's aviation industry was outproducing America's by a factor of nearly 4 to 1. Within weeks of Roosevelt's speech, the American industrial landscape began transforming with a speed that defied all historical precedent. On June 10, 1940, the president signed the National Defense Advisory Commission into law, creating the bureaucratic framework for what would become the largest industrial mobilization in human history. William Knudsen, despite his thick German accent, a detail that would later strike observers as deeply ironic, took charge of coordinating production. His first task was to convince automotive executives that building aircraft wasn't fundamentally different from building cars, merely more complex and requiring tighter tolerances. The automotive industry's response was initially cautious. Henry Ford, whose isolationist sympathies were well known, resisted converting his factories to military production. But other manufacturers recognized both the patriotic duty and the profitable opportunity. On July 22, 1940, General Motors announced it would convert portions of its manufacturing capacity to aircraft engine production. Chrysler followed with plans for a tank arsenal. By September, even Ford had relented, agreeing to build a massive new factory at Willow Run, Michigan, dedicated solely to producing B-24 Liberator bombers. The challenges were immense and immediate. Aircraft manufacturing in 1940 was still largely an artisanal craft. At Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle, skilled craftsmen hand-fitted each aluminum panel onto B-17 Flying Fortress airframes, a process that could take months for a single aircraft. The tolerances required for aircraft were measured in thousandths of an inch, far tighter than automotive standards. Workers needed entirely new skills, and the existing workforce was nowhere near large enough. The aviation industry would need to grow from 63,000 workers to over 2 million in less than 4 years, a 30-fold increase that would require training programs on a scale never before attempted. Donald Douglas, founder of Douglas Aircraft, became one of the mobilization's early heroes. His company's factories in Santa Monica and Long Beach, California, began implementing revolutionary production techniques borrowed from automotive assembly lines. Douglas engineers designed jigs and fixtures that allowed less skilled workers to assemble complex aircraft components with precision. The company established training schools that could take someone with no manufacturing experience and turn them into a competent aircraft assembler in 6 weeks. By December 1940, Douglas had tripled its workforce and doubled its production rate. Historical records from the Douglas Aircraft Company archives show that the firm delivered 843 aircraft in 1941, compared to just 314 in 1940. The labor force transformation proved one of the mobilization's most remarkable aspects. Women, who had comprised less than 1% of the aviation workforce in 1939, began flooding into factories. Naomi Parker Fraley, working at the Naval Air Station in Alameda, California, became the inspiration for the iconic Rosie the Riveter image, though she wouldn't receive credit for decades. African Americans, previously excluded from most aviation jobs due to discriminatory hiring practices, found new opportunities as labor shortages forced companies to abandon racist policies. By 1942, the aviation workforce had become the most diverse in American industrial history. Roosevelt's administration poured unprecedented resources into factory construction. The Defense Plant Corporation, a government entity created to finance industrial expansion, approved loans totaling over $9 billion by the end of 1941, roughly $160 billion in modern terms. Entire new cities sprang up around aircraft plants. Wichita, Kansas transformed from a modest city of 114,000 into a boomtown of over 200,000 as Boeing, Beechcraft, and Cessna expanded operations. January 1, 1941 marked a psychological turning point, though Pearl Harbor still lay 11 months in the future. American aircraft production had reached 800 planes per month, still far short of Roosevelt's goals, but quintuple the rate from just 18 months earlier. The factories were finding their rhythm, and the production techniques that would ultimately overwhelm the Axis powers were beginning to crystallize. In Wichita, Boeing's engineers had reduced B-29 Superfortress production time from 35,000 man-hours per aircraft to just 18,000 through innovative assembly methods. The Ford Willow Run plant opened in stages throughout 1941, and it exemplified both the promise and the problems of rapid mobilization. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, had promised Henry Ford that he could apply automobile assembly line techniques to bomber production and achieve unprecedented efficiency. The Willow Run facility would eventually become the largest room under one roof in the world, 3.5 million square feet of factory space with a mile-long assembly line. But initial production proved nightmarish. The B-24 Liberator was exponentially more complex than a car, with over 1.2 million individual parts. Early attempts to rush planes through the assembly line resulted in aircraft that couldn't fly, requiring extensive rework that defeated the entire purpose of mass production. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, transformed American mobilization from impressive to fanatical. Within days, Congress declared war on Japan, Germany, and Italy. The industrial constraints that had limited production, concerns about overtime costs, material allocations, factory expansion limits, evaporated overnight. Roosevelt met with industrial leaders on December 15th and raised his production targets again. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943. The numbers that had seemed fantastical 20 months earlier now seemed barely adequate. Intelligence reports indicated that Germany had produced more than 11,000 aircraft in 1940, and Japan had produced roughly 5,000. America needed not just numerical parity, but overwhelming superiority. The production surge required solving countless technical and logistical challenges. Aluminum, the primary material for aircraft construction, became desperately scarce as demand exploded. The Aluminum Company of America, which had enjoyed a virtual monopoly on American aluminum production, launched a massive expansion program. New smelting facilities opened across the Pacific Northwest, taking advantage of cheap hydroelectric power from dams like Grand Coulee and Bonneville. By mid-1942, American aluminum production had tripled from 1939 levels, reaching nearly 800,000 tons annually, according to research compiled by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after the war. The standardization of aircraft designs proved crucial to achieving mass production. The Army Air Forces reluctantly accepted that constantly upgrading designs to incorporate the latest improvements was incompatible with high-volume production. Boeing's B-17, Douglas's C-47 transport, and North American's P-51 Mustang fighter entered extended production runs with only minor modifications. This allowed factories to achieve learning curve efficiencies. Each successive aircraft required fewer man-hours to build as workers gained experience and engineers refined production processes. Subcontracting networks emerged as another key innovation. Major aircraft manufacturers like Boeing, Douglas, and Consolidated couldn't possibly build every component of their increasingly complex designs. The B-29 Superfortress, for instance, had parts manufactured by over 1,500 separate suppliers scattered across the country. This distributed production model made the industry more resilient to disruption and allowed specialized manufacturers to focus on components where they had particular expertise. It also meant that industrial mobilization reached into every corner of the American economy. Companies that had previously made washing machines were now fabricating wing sections, and furniture manufacturers were building aircraft interiors. The human cost of this breakneck expansion was substantial, but rarely discussed in the triumphant narratives of American production. Industrial accidents killed thousands of workers during the war years. The pace was relentless. Many aircraft plants operated 3 shifts per day, 7 days per week, with workers putting in 60 or even 70 hours weekly. Labor unions, which had been flexing new power granted by New Deal legislation, largely subordinated demands for better wages and conditions to the war effort. Though wildcat strikes still erupted periodically when working conditions became intolerable. By January 1, 1942, American factories had produced over 19,000 military aircraft in the previous year, and the production curve was still accelerating sharply upward. In Germany, Albert Speer, recently appointed as Minister of Armaments and War Production, studied intelligence reports on American production with growing alarm. The numbers seemed impossible, yet his sources confirmed them. Speer understood industrial capacity better than most Nazi leaders. He recognized that America's automobile industry had given it a production advantage that Germany simply couldn't match. He urged Hitler to dramatically expand German aircraft production, but the Führer remained confident that the war would be won before American production could matter. The spring and summer of 1942 witnessed American production fully hitting its stride. Ford's Willow Run plant, after months of painful debugging, began producing B-24 Liberators at steadily increasing rates. By June, the plant was completing 1 bomber every 4 hours. By October, 1 bomber every hour. The final optimized production rate would reach 1 B-24 every 63 minutes, a 4-engine heavy bomber with 10 crew stations, 10 defensive machine guns, and capacity to carry 8,000 pounds of bombs across ranges exceeding 2,000 miles, rolling off the assembly line faster than most people could drive to a neighboring city. Douglas Aircraft's operations at Long Beach had similarly refined C-47 Skytrain production to an art form. The C-47, a military transport variant of the civilian DC-3 airliner, proved one of the war's most valuable aircraft. It carried paratroopers, evacuated wounded soldiers, hauled supplies over the Himalayas to China, and provided the backbone of Allied logistics. Douglas built them so efficiently that the Army Air Forces could essentially treat them as expendable. Historical documentation from the Army Air Force's Statistical Digest shows that Douglas and its licensees produced over 10,000 C-47s during the war years, an average of nearly 7 per day for 4 years. The B-29 Superfortress program represented perhaps the war's greatest industrial gamble. Boeing's design for a very heavy bomber with pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets, and the range to strike Japan from distant bases was technologically ambitious to the point of recklessness. The aircraft was ordered into production in May 1941, before the first prototype had even flown. This concurrency approach meant that thousands of engineers were designing production tooling and factories were being built, while test pilots were still discovering fundamental design flaws. The program cost over $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bomb. But it worked. The B-29 entered service in mid-1944 and became the decisive weapon in the air campaign against Japan. North American aviation's P-51 Mustang fighter emerged as another production triumph. The aircraft had been designed and built in just 117 days in 1940 to meet a British Purchasing Commission's requirements. Early versions with Allison engines proved disappointing, but when Rolls-Royce Merlin engines were substituted, the Mustang became arguably the finest fighter aircraft of the war. North American's Inglewood, California plant, along with a new facility in Dallas, Texas, eventually produced over 15,000 Mustangs. The Dallas plant achieved remarkable efficiency. By late 1944, it could produce a complete P-51 in under 4,000 man-hours, roughly one-fifth the time required for early production aircraft. By December 31, 1942, American factories had delivered nearly 48,000 military aircraft, more than Germany and Japan produced combined that year. The production numbers were becoming a strategic weapon in themselves. American bombers could be used more aggressively because losses could be rapidly replaced. Training could be expanded because training aircraft were plentiful. The aerial battle over Europe was increasingly becoming a war of attrition, and America's industrial base ensured that the Allies could replace losses while the Luftwaffe could not. German propaganda had stopped mocking Roosevelt's production claims. Instead, Goebbels's broadcasts now insisted that quantity couldn't defeat German quality, that superior German aircraft and pilots would overcome mere numbers. This represented a tacit admission that the production race had been lost. German aircraft production did increase substantially under Speer's management, reaching approximately 25,000 aircraft in 1943. But this was achieved only by diverting resources from other critical needs and still fell far short of Allied production. The Pacific Theater illustrated the strategic impact of American production advantages. After devastating losses at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines campaign, the U.S. Navy had rebuilt its carrier aviation forces with stunning speed. The Battle of Midway in early June 1942 had been won partly through American code-breaking, but also because American carriers embarked more aircraft than their Japanese counterparts and could afford to take risks with those aircraft that Japanese commanders, aware of their limited production capacity, could not. The year 1943 witnessed American aircraft production reach levels that would have seemed hallucinatory just 3 years earlier. On January 20th, during his State of the Union address, President Roosevelt announced new production targets that exceeded even his previous ambitious goals: 125,000 aircraft for the year. Skeptics had long since stopped doubting whether America could hit such numbers. The only question was whether the targets were high enough. The factories, now fully tooled and staffed with experienced workers, were demonstrating capabilities that exceeded the planners' most optimistic projections. By summer 1943, the cumulative weight of American production was fundamentally altering the strategic balance. In Europe, the 8th Air Force, based in England, had grown from a token force of a few dozen bombers in late 1942 to an armada of over 1,000 heavy bombers by August 1943. These aircraft, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators flew deep into Germany in formations of several hundred bombers, escorted by growing numbers of fighters. The industrial cities of the Ruhr Valley, Hamburg, and later Berlin itself came under sustained aerial assault. German fighters exacted a terrible toll on the bomber formations, but American factories replaced lost aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. The naval air war in the Pacific demonstrated even more dramatically how industrial capacity could translate into military victory. American shipyards were launching new Essex-class aircraft carriers at a rate of roughly one per month, each capable of embarking 90 aircraft. Grumman's Hellcat fighters, specifically designed to counter the Japanese Zero, poured from factories on Long Island. By late 1943, American carrier task forces operated with a casual aggression that would have been suicidal earlier in the war. They could afford to lose aircraft and pilots in numbers that would have paralyzed the Japanese Navy, because replacement aircraft arrived constantly, and training programs graduated thousands of new pilots monthly. According to detailed production statistics maintained by the Army Air Forces and compiled in the Statistical Digest of the War, American factories produced 85,898 military aircraft in 1943, exceeding Roosevelt's target by more than 68%. This single year's production surpassed Germany's entire output from 1939 through 1941. The total included 21,358 heavy bombers, 23,988 medium and light bombers, and 23,921 fighters. Training aircraft, transports, and other types comprised the remainder. The human infrastructure supporting this production had become equally impressive. The aviation industry employed over 2.1 million workers by mid-1943, with women comprising roughly 40% of the workforce. These Rosie the Riveters weren't just working entry-level positions. Women served as inspectors, tool designers, even test pilots. Marina Ruskova's female flying regiment in the Soviet Union received Lend-Lease aircraft built largely by American women, a detail that both nations found symbolically powerful. African American workers, though still facing discrimination in housing and advancement opportunities, had become essential to production. Companies that had refused to hire black workers in 1940 now actively recruited in southern states. The distribution of production across the country revealed how thoroughly mobilization had transformed American geography. California, with its concentration of aviation firms and ideal flying weather for testing, produced roughly 40% of American military aircraft. The Los Angeles basin alone housed Douglas Aircraft's multiple plants, North American Aviation, Lockheed, Vultee, and Northrop. The region's population had exploded, with hundreds of thousands of workers migrating from across the country. Seattle, home to Boeing's main facilities, had similarly experienced explosive growth. But production had also spread to previously non-industrial regions. Tulsa, Oklahoma, hosted major bomber production. Omaha, Nebraska built bombers. Dallas and Fort Worth in Texas manufactured fighters and bombers. The strategic impact extended beyond simply having aircraft available. The production surge enabled tactical innovations that would have been impossible with limited numbers. The development of long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang succeeded partly because factories could produce enough of them to accompany bomber formations throughout entire missions. The daylight strategic bombing campaign over Germany, controversial and costly though it was, proceeded because lost bombers could be replaced. The island-hopping campaign across the Pacific succeeded partly because Marine Corps squadrons could be equipped with new aircraft whenever losses mounted or newer models became available. Lend-Lease programs distributed American production globally, multiplying its strategic effect. By 1943, American factories were producing not just for American forces, but for allies worldwide. The Soviet Union received thousands of fighters and bombers through dangerous Arctic and Pacific supply routes. Britain's Royal Air Force flew American-built Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Mitchells, and Bostons alongside their own aircraft. Free French, Chinese, Australian, Brazilian, and numerous other Allied air forces operated American aircraft. This global distribution created standardization benefits. Pilots could be trained on common types, maintenance procedures could be shared, and combat lessons learned in one theater could be rapidly applied elsewhere. January 1, 1944 arrived with the outcome of the war, while far from certain in timing, increasingly inevitable in direction. The combined weight of American, British, and Soviet production had created a material imbalance that Germany and Japan simply could not overcome. American aircraft production alone exceeded the combined output of all Axis powers. When British, Canadian, and Soviet production was added, the disparity became overwhelming. German industrial planner Albert Speer achieved remarkable increases in German production during 1944, despite intensifying Allied bombing, but his efforts merely slowed the rate of decline rather than reversing the strategic balance. The D-Day invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, showcased the aerial dominance that American production had enabled. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties on D-Day itself, with American fighters and bombers comprising the majority. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 100 sorties, so completely had Allied air superiority been established. The months-long air campaign preceding the invasion had destroyed French transportation networks and isolated the Normandy battlefield, making it impossible for Germany to mass forces against the beachheads. Every bridge bombed, every rail yard destroyed, represented not just tactical success, but the industrial capacity to sustain such operations indefinitely. Ford's Willow Run plant had by this point become a symbol of American industrial might and a regular stop for visiting dignitaries and journalists. In peak production months, the facility completed over 500 B-24 Liberators, more than Germany's entire monthly four-engine bomber production. Henry Ford, whatever his earlier reluctance, now took visible pride in the plant's achievements. When Soviet delegates toured Willow Run in July 1944, they returned home with respect bordering on fear for American industrial capacity. The plant had become propaganda in itself, a physical demonstration that the production figures published by the War Production Board were real, not inflated for morale purposes as Axis propaganda insisted. The strategic bombing campaign reached its crescendo during 1944. 8th Air Force missions over Germany routinely involved more than 1,000 heavy bombers, escorted by similar numbers of fighters. The oil campaign, targeting Germany's synthetic fuel production facilities, achieved devastating effectiveness. By late summer 1944, Germany's aviation fuel production had been reduced to a fraction of peacetime levels, grounding training programs and limiting operational flying hours. The Luftwaffe still possessed aircraft. German factories produced nearly 40,000 aircraft in 1944, but couldn't fuel or crew them effectively. American factories had produced both the bombers that destroyed the fuel plants and the fighters that cleared the skies of German defenders. In the Pacific, the strategic air campaign against Japan began in earnest as B-29 super fortresses staged through newly captured bases in the Mariana Islands. The bombing of Tokyo and other Japanese cities, while controversial both then and since, demonstrated the extreme end state of industrial warfare. American production had created a weapon, the B-29, that could fly from distant bases, deliver massive bomb loads, and return safely with minimal fighter opposition. Japan's air defenses, already weakened by years of attrition warfare, proved incapable of stopping the raids. The firebombing campaign killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians and destroyed dozens of cities. Yet American losses remained relatively light because American factories could provide the specialized equipment, training aircraft, and replacement bombers necessary to sustain such operations. Total American aircraft production for 1944 reached 96,369 aircraft, according to Army Air Forces records. This represented a slight decline from 1943's peak, but the reduction was deliberate. Production emphasis had shifted toward quality and capability rather than sheer quantity. Factories produced more heavy bombers and fewer light aircraft, more long-range fighters and fewer trainers. The decline also reflected that American forces had sufficient aircraft in inventory, that production could shift partially toward replacement aircraft rather than building new units from scratch. The human cost of achieving this production had been substantial. Tens of thousands of workers had been injured in industrial accidents, hundreds killed. The social disruption created by mobilization, families separated, communities transformed overnight, traditional social structures upended, had been profound. Yet for most Americans, these costs seemed bearable given the stakes. War bond rallies, scrap metal drives, rationing programs, and victory gardens all contributed to a sense of shared national purpose. The factories represented not just industrial capacity, but collective determination. By December 31, 1944, Germany's military situation had become hopeless, barring a miracle that wasn't forthcoming. The Red Army was advancing from the east, Allied. Armies from the west and overhead, American and British aircraft flew with near impunity. Japan's situation, while not yet as desperate, was deteriorating rapidly. American submarines had strangled Japanese shipping, American carriers had destroyed Japanese naval aviation, and American bombers were systematically destroying Japanese cities. The industrial might that Roosevelt had promised to mobilize in May 1940 had become the decisive factor in history's largest war. April 12, 1945 brought the shocking news of President Franklin Roosevelt's death from a cerebral hemorrhage at his Warm Springs, Georgia retreat. The man who had promised to build an arsenal of democracy would not live to see final victory. Roosevelt died knowing, however, that his industrial mobilization had succeeded beyond even his ambitious expectations. American factories had by that point delivered over 260,000 military aircraft since his May 1940 speech, more than 5 times his initial promise, and that promise had itself been dismissed as impossible propaganda. The final months of the European war demonstrated the absolute aerial superiority that American production had purchased. The Luftwaffe, though still capable of isolated operations, had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. German jet fighters like the Me-262 represented impressive technological achievements, but arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. Germany's production facilities, despite Albert Speer's heroic efforts to disperse them underground and into rural areas, could no longer sustain military operations. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Allied air forces were conducting thousands of sorties daily, while the Luftwaffe managed barely dozens. The Pacific War's conclusion underscored both the power and terrible cost of industrial warfare. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, were delivered by B-29 superfortresses, aircraft that existed only because American industry had successfully mass-produced one of the most complex machines ever designed. The Enola Gay and Bockscar, the bombers that carried those weapons, represented the ultimate manifestation of industrial capacity applied to warfare. Each B-29 contained over 55,000 individual parts and required 140,000 man-hours to construct, yet American factories built nearly 4,000 of them. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945 officially ended the Second World War. The final production figures stood as a testament to industrial mobilization unprecedented in scale. American factories had produced 300,317 military aircraft between May 1940 and August 1945. This included 99,743 bombers of all types, 99,850 fighters, and over 100,000 training, transport, and other support aircraft. These numbers exceeded Roosevelt's promises by over 300%, thoroughly vindicating his claims that German propagandists had mocked as impossible. Comparative statistics illustrated the industrial gulf that had decided the war. Germany produced approximately 119,000 military aircraft during the war years, Japan approximately 76,000, and Italy approximately 11,000. A combined total of 206,000 aircraft from all 3 Axis powers. The United States alone produced 46% more aircraft than all 3 enemies combined, and when British Commonwealth and Soviet production was added, the Allied advantage exceeded 2-to-1. These raw numbers understated Allied advantages because American aircraft tended to be larger, more complex, and more capable than their opponents. A single B-29 superfortress represented more industrial capacity than 10 German Me-109 fighters. The cost calculations proved equally staggering. The War Production Board estimated that aircraft production had consumed approximately $45 billion in government expenditures, roughly $650 billion in modern purchasing power. This spending had created roughly 2.1 million jobs at peak employment, transformed dozens of cities, advanced manufacturing technology by decades, and created an aerospace industry that would dominate global aviation for generations. The social costs: disrupted families, sacrificed opportunities, injured and killed workers, transformed communities, resisted precise calculation, but were substantial. Historical analysis, including detailed research by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted immediately after the war, confirmed that strategic bombing's effectiveness remained controversial, but industrial mobilization's impact was indisputable. Germany and Japan had not been defeated primarily by aerial bombardment, but by the comprehensive application of Allied material superiority across all domains. Aircraft had been crucial, not just for bombing, but for maintaining air superiority, interdicting enemy supply lines, providing close air support, conducting reconnaissance, and transporting supplies. The sheer abundance of American aircraft had enabled operations and absorbed losses that would have been impossible for more resource-constrained nations. The conversion back to peacetime production happened with stunning speed. By September 1945, the War Production Board was already canceling contracts and shuttering facilities. Thousands of workers received pink slips within days of Japan's surrender. The vast industrial base that had produced 300,000 warplanes would now produce civilian airliners, private aircraft, and military planes in much smaller peacetime quantities. Many facilities closed permanently. The massive Glenn L. Martin plant in Omaha, Nebraska, which had built thousands of bombers, ceased aircraft production entirely. Others transitioned to civilian work. Ford's Willow Run plant, after producing 8,685 B-24 Liberators, would eventually produce automobiles. 10 years after victory on May 8, 1955, veterans, politicians, and historians gathered across America and Europe to commemorate the war's end. The speeches inevitably highlighted the triumph of democracy over fascism, but many speakers also emphasized the industrial achievement that had made military victory possible. The arsenal of democracy that Roosevelt had promised to build had not only been built, but had exceeded all expectations. The question now was what lessons this unprecedented mobilization held for peacetime and for future conflicts. The industrial legacy proved multifaceted and enduring. The aviation industry that had grown from 63,000 workers to over 2 million during the war didn't simply disappear. Commercial aviation exploded in the post-war years, with military transports like the C-47 finding civilian applications. Douglas, Boeing, and Lockheed became dominant global aircraft manufacturers, leveraging wartime experience and government-funded facilities into commercial success. The jet age, which transformed global travel and commerce, built directly on technologies and manufacturing techniques developed during wartime mobilization. The military-industrial complex that President Dwight Eisenhower would warn against in his 1961 farewell address had its origins in the aircraft factories of World War II. The human legacy was equally complex. Women who had proven their capability in factories and offices found themselves pushed back toward traditional roles in the immediate post-war period. Rosie the Riveter was expected to become a housewife again, though many women continued working, and the wartime experience planted seeds for later feminist movements. African American workers who had gained access to industrial jobs during the war faced renewed discrimination in the post-war period, though their contributions had demonstrated capabilities that would fuel the civil rights movement. The GI Bill, which provided education and housing benefits to veterans, created opportunities that transformed American society. But these opportunities weren't equally distributed across racial lines. The geopolitical consequences of industrial mobilization reshaped the world order. American production capacity had made the United States the indispensable ally, providing military equipment not just for American forces but for allies worldwide through Lend-Lease. This established patterns of military cooperation and dependence that would define the Cold War era. The Soviet Union, despite its own impressive wartime production, recognized it couldn't match American industrial capacity in a sustained competition. This realization contributed to Soviet strategy, emphasizing nuclear weapons and asymmetric approaches rather than conventional military parity. The strategic lessons military planners drew from the experience shaped doctrine for decades. Industrial capacity and logistical sustainability became recognized as crucial elements of military power alongside tactical skill and operational art. The lesson seemingly learned was that wars between industrial powers would be won by the side that could outproduce its opponent. This appeared validated by Korean War experiences. American industry quickly ramped up production again, though never to World War II levels. Vietnam would later challenge these assumptions, demonstrating that industrial capacity alone couldn't guarantee victory against determined opponents fighting with different objectives. The economic legacy transformed American capitalism. The close cooperation between government and industry during the war created models of public-private partnership that continued in modified forms during peacetime. Defense spending remained at historically high levels even after demobilization, sustaining industries and employment in ways that would have seemed unimaginable before 1940. The military-industrial academic complex that developed in the post-war years, with government contracts funding research at universities and private companies, had its roots in wartime mobilization patterns. The technological advancements achieved under wartime pressure accelerated development across numerous fields. Manufacturing techniques developed for aircraft production found applications throughout industry. Quality control methods, inventory management systems, and supply chain logistics all advanced significantly. The systems engineering approaches necessary to manage production of aircraft with over 1 million parts found applications in everything from automobile manufacturing to construction. Computers, which had been used during the war primarily for ballistics calculations, found commercial applications partly because the industrial base and engineering talent existed to develop them. The myth-making around American production became part of national identity. The narrative of a sleeping giant awakened, of assembly lines producing democracy's weapons faster than dictators could destroy them, resonated deeply in American culture. This narrative contained truth but also simplified complexities. It downplayed Allied contributions, British intelligence, Soviet sacrifice, Chinese resistance, that had been equally crucial to victory. It glossed over the moral complexities of strategic bombing and the racism that persisted even within the arsenal of democracy. But the core truth remained. American industry had achieved something genuinely remarkable, transforming what German propagandists had dismissed as impossible fantasy into decisive reality. 70 years after Roosevelt's death, on April 12, 2015, historians could assess the aircraft production achievement with greater perspective. The 300,000 aircraft produced represented more than just industrial capacity. They embodied a moment when a nation subordinated nearly everything to a single goal. Whether such comprehensive mobilization remains possible in modern, more complex economies is debatable. The specialized, just-in-time production systems that dominate contemporary manufacturing might prove less adaptable than 1940's more flexible industrial base. But the achievement stands as proof that dramatic industrial transformation remains possible when necessity demands and leadership directs it. The final accounting reveals numbers that still astonish. 300,000 aircraft in 4 years, from an industry producing 6,000 annually before mobilization began. Roosevelt's promise, dismissed as propaganda by Joseph Goebbels and doubted even by American military leaders, had been exceeded by 300%. The Luftwaffe pilots who had mocked American resolve found themselves overwhelmed by waves of bombers and fighters that never stopped coming. Albert Speer, the most capable of Nazi industrial managers, concluded after the war that Germany had lost the production battle by 1943, and nothing thereafter could reverse that defeat. The impossible had become inevitable, and the arsenal of democracy had proven decisive.